When photography was invented almost a century and a half ago, the spectacle of the Niagara Falls naturally attracted the camera. Here at the falls, the early camera began to catch tourists, encourage publicity stunts, and even record tragedies. During the last century, photography was transformed from a slow, restricted process into an all-seeing eye which could keep pace with the action and show what it saw to millions. Back in the early days, one of the first professionals to set up at Niagara was an enterprising operator called Platt Babbitt, who focused on the tourist trade. Tourists on the American side of the falls look at it from here at Prospect Point. And this is where Platt Babbitt had his franchise. Babbitt set up a canopy over his camera, just about where our camera is now. Then did something unusual. He snapped the tourists unawares and then sold them the pictures. This meant that his pictures, in contrast to the other more formal pictures of the time, looked very natural. Of course, to get that kind of informal picture, the camera had to snap fast. And here, Babbitt was helped by the bright light reflected from the falls. It must have been a good pitch, because Babbitt fought very hard to keep his monopoly. When a Scotsman came up here and tried to set up in competition, Babbitt sabotaged him. Every time the Scotsman took the cap off his lens to make an exposure, Babbitt would jump up and down in front of his camera, waving an open umbrella to try and spoil his shot. That Scots rival must have been persistent, because eventually Babbitt was driven off his pitch here at Niagara. But not before he photographed an event which produced one of the most dramatic and earliest of news pictures. A man had been sailing his boat upriver when he was capsized by the current and carried down here into the rapids just above the falls. Before he was carried over the edge, he clambered onto a rock, and he was there for hours. The people on the bank made every effort to try and save him, and while all this was going on, Babbitt brought his camera down and took this picture of the stranded man. All the rescue attempts failed, and the exhausted man was eventually swept over the falls to his death. Niagara was also a good pitch because its fame attracted all sorts of events. Captain Webb, the first man to swim the English Channel, tried to swim the river above the falls. He too was swept away. But Mrs. Webb made the best of it. She came to Niagara and sold souvenir photos of her late husband. In 1859, Blondin had crossed the falls on a tightrope and survived. His pause in midair helped the slow camera catch the act. But he was upstaged by a Signorina Spelterini, who performed the same stunt, with her feet in buckets. To look exciting, a good action photograph had to catch its subject in the act, or at least appear to. Wild animals were the most elusive subjects of all. Indeed, studies like these would need a fast shutter and a telephoto lens, neither of which was invented when the picture was made in the 1850s. The ingenious photographer simply got round the problem by using a stuffed stag. The photographer, John Dillwyn Llewellyn, was one of the first to use the calotype process, invented by his relative Fox Talbot in the 1840s. So Llewellyn and his wife had a special family interest in the new techniques. Like so many Victorian gentlemen, Llewellyn dabbled in science, and he rose to the challenge of capturing subjects in motion. When an improved process called wet collodion was introduced in 1851, Llewellyn took it up enthusiastically, although it was cumbersome. Glass plates had to be prepared on the spot, then developed immediately in a portable dark room. But collodion was more sensitive to light, and therefore faster than the original calotypes, which it soon displaced. The instantaneous photograph, so-called, with an exposure time of a second or so, now became possible, though it was still prudent to keep a firm hold on an animal, unless it was well trained. By 1854, Llewellyn's lively outdoor photographs had, according to his daughter, caught the eye of another great photo enthusiast.
He exhibited the first instantaneous photographs in London, and great excitement prevailed when a message arrived asking for fresh copies of 2 of his pictures to replace those which Queen Victoria had admired so much she insisted on carrying them off.
Llewellyn exhibited 4 photographs under the title Motion, to the astonishment of the press.
One represents a steamboat at a pier and has fixed instantaneously the floating smoke and steam.
The line of the waves here suggests that Llewellyn's exposure time was less than a second, helped no doubt by the extra light reflected from the sea. The following year, a French photographer, Gustave Legray, took this ambitious picture. It shows warships firing a salute to an admiral who died in 1855. The light reflected from the water also reduced the contrast between sea and sky. In early photographs, the skies came out white, leaving the picture bald-headed. But in seascapes, Legray got strong cloud effects. In 1856, his photograph, Brig Upon the Water, was acclaimed the grandest effort ever seen in photography. But Legray soon had competition. This view was also taken in 1856 by a Scottish professional, George Washington Wilson. The gunsmoke here comes from a broadside fired by the Royal Navy for the benefit of Wilson's stereoscopic camera. Wilson claimed an exposure of 1/6 of a second by the homely method of taking the caps off the lenses with one hand, then recapping immediately with his Glengarry bonnet. The stereoscopic camera, which gave a 3-dimensional effect, had twin lenses of short focal length, which concentrated the light on a tiny pair of plates, thus cutting exposure time and freezing motion. Having mastered the sea, the camera was now able to take to the streets. Wilson showed the traffic in Edinburgh in 1859. That same year in America, Edward Anthony caught the bustle of Broadway in the rain. The high angle of these street scenes served a double purpose. It gave depth to the stereo view, and by shooting along the line of the traffic, it reduced the movement. Mechanical shutters came into general use in the 1880s and gave split-second exposures for fast-moving subjects. If the unwilling subject still presented problems, official photography had its own techniques for overcoming them. This man is literally in the clutches of the police, and he was just a witness. By stopping the action, the still photograph came to life. Miss Watt, the world's greatest lady diver. The aristocracy also showed their paces. This bounder was caught by Count Esterhazy. And we can only hope this fella made it. There's no follow-up photograph. The snapshot's mastery of suspense soon made it the servant of show business. It was the introduction of the dry plate which first brought photography within the reach of ordinary people. All the complex paraphernalia of the wet plate disappeared. Cameras became much cheaper and much easier to use, and of course, much smaller. The candid camera had arrived. This created a new kind of excitement, that slightly illicit thrill of catching people unawares. In the late 1880s and 90s, a whole range of detective cameras were produced so that you could take sneak pictures. Now, these usually combined rather poor performance with improbable disguise. This is a roll film camera, and one of the favorite disguises of the time, the brown paper parcel. And this is the book camera. It probably looked quite convincing if you weren't close up. This is much smaller and, of course, much easier to conceal. It's the pocket watch camera. It dates from about 1895. But just as ingenious, and certainly my favorite, is this waistcoat camera. It was hung round the neck in a string, and this lens peeped through the waistcoat buttonhole. It took 6 snaps and a circular plate inside. Now, we actually have a set of these pictures, and for sneak pictures, I find them rather surprising, because they raise the question, why did he bother? One of the finest exponents of the candid camera was Paul Martin, a London artisan. As an apprentice in this engraver's workshop, his experience probably helped when he took up photography as an impoverished amateur in 1884. As one of the first working-class amateurs, Martin seems to move more easily through London, snapping life in the streets. And he was sometimes on the right spot for moments of street drama. Paul Martin had a hand camera and a quick eye. He was one of the first to display a sense of that moment of selection which came to distinguish the best candid camera work. His pictures of folk at play have all the warmth and informality brought to photography in the 1890s by the new breed of amateurs with their fast, cheap cameras. Now, as photography was catching up with the action, it was also learning how to cope with that other old enemy, the dark. And the breakthrough came in the 1860s, using this substance. It's magnesium. Now, magnesium, as you can see, burned with a brilliant but very harsh light. So they experimented with other sources around that time, and one of them was that miracle of Victorian science, electricity. The most dramatic demonstration was made almost inevitably by that great showman in Paris, Felix Nadar. These are the catacombs under Paris. There are 6 or 7 million dead people down here, or at least what's left of them. It's a bizarre venue for a scientific breakthrough, but it was here in 1861 that Felix Nadar took the first photographs on location using electric light. He had a mass of Bunsen batteries in the street up above the catacombs, and he ran his cables down here to his arc lights. But even then, it was just as well that his subjects were dead, because each exposure took Nadar 18 minutes to make. The electric photographs caused a sensation when they were exhibited. Because of the length of the exposures, Nadar dressed up a dummy to enliven the scenes in the catacombs. And using the same lights, he moved on to take another set of photographs, this time in the Paris sewers. It took Nadar 3 months to get all his pictures. During the long exposures, he complained, someone somewhere up above would pull out a bath plug and fill the sewers with steam. In Britain, photographers experimented with burning magnesium as a light source. This engraving shows a demonstration of its effectiveness as a source of light for the portrait studio. This magnesium-lit portrait of Sir David Brewster, who had perfected stereophotography, was taken in 1864. But the hard artificial light was unflattering. The portraits, though a technical triumph, are crude in comparison with the best portraits of the time, modelled with natural light. However, magnesium had one great advantage over cable-bound electricity. It could be taken almost anywhere. And in 1865, Professor Piazzi Smythe took his flares into the inner chambers of the Great Pyramid. Smythe, who was Astronomer Royal for Scotland, hoped to find the secret of the universe through the geometry of the pyramids. Smythe burned 2 flares for each exposure, and this gave his photographs their only moment of mystery. These ghostly Arabs must have moved off between flares. Faster shutters and improved dry plates came in the 1880s, along with exploding mixtures, which were used as flashlights. Flash photography could be a dangerous business in the early days. The first photojournalist was a man called Jacob Riis, and he worked here in New York. Now, Riis was trying to expose the conditions in the slums around here in the 1880s, which meant he needed artificial light to get into the dark basements and into the dingy back alleys. But it was a very dangerous game, as Riis discovered. Using a frying pan and heaps of exploding powder, he almost blinded himself. At other times, he was chased by startled dusters that he wakened in the middle of the night. And finally, he almost killed 6 blind beggars when he set off his flash powder in an attic room and set fire to the walls. Fortunately, the fire was put out because, a policeman told him later, the house was just too dirty to burn. But Jacob Riis and his fellow muckrakers in journalism had one big problem. News photographs still had to be published as engravings. The Illustrated London News began publication back in 1842, when photography was just 3 years old. Its first front page carried an artist's impression of the great fire which destroyed Hamburg only a week before. Unknown to the publishers, daguerreotypes of the ruins had actually been made, and one still survives, the first ever news photograph. As circulations grew, illustrated journals hired photographers to search out news events like floods and fires. But the scenes had then to be engraved for publication, a process which was faithful to the original, but lacked that authenticity peculiar to the photograph. politics was soon added to the photographer's agenda. This is an election meeting in Dover in the 1860s. And Gladstone was snapped on a whistle-stop campaign. Another news form, the photo interview, was pioneered by the irrepressible Nadar in Paris. Nadar, standing in the background, interviewed the scientist Chevret for his 100th birthday, while his son Paul took a sequence of pictures for Le Journal Illustré. The old scientist was a particularly apt choice for this experiment. He had chaired the meeting in Paris back in 1839, when photography was announced to the world. But Chevret had obviously not been over-impressed.
I was an enemy of photography until my 97th year, but 3 years ago I capitulated.
The edition was a sellout, but the idea was not followed through. The technical problem for newspapers was to find a way of printing photographs on the same page as the news type. The advance came in 1880 in New York with this photograph of a shanty town. The secret of its success was the invention of a screen which broke up the photograph into a pattern of lines and could then be inked onto the newsprint to recreate the picture. But again, the breakthrough in the daily graphic was not pursued. Newspaper publishing is a conservative business. It was left to a new generation of illustrated magazines to oust the engraving. Then, in 1896, the New York Times brought out a weekend photo supplement, and in 97, the rival Tribune experimented with photographs on high-speed presses. All the elements for news photography as we know it were at last assembled. These machines can print up pictures cabled from any part of the world in a matter of minutes. I make it 41 photos in today's Daily Mirror, and nowadays it would be hard to imagine the popular dailies without their pictures. When the Daily Mirror first started, it was a paper for women, and it flopped. Then, in 1904, it started printing pictures. It was the first daily in the world to do so. Circulation jumped. It signaled the coming of a new kind of professional, the news photographer. Three brothers called Grant, who worked for the Daily Mirror, helped establish the now familiar style of news photography. The circulation of the Mirror was boosted by action photographs, which showed the excitements offered by the 20th century. This is Blériot, the first man to fly the English Channel in 1909. The airship offered a perfect camera platform, if you had the nerve. And the news camera reported the hazards of demanding equal rights for women. This night photo of the fire brigade in action shows the dramatic potential of the flashlight, although it took a whole bank of arc lights to show the funeral of the Emperor of Japan. In 1911, the cameraman became his own news story. The Daily Mirror reported that Thomas Grant, their photographic correspondent, had been expelled from a war in North Africa by the Italian army. The photographer hit the headlines. News photography had finally made it.
In the next episode of Camera, Truth and Beauty, Gus MacDonald shows how photography aspired to art. Some photographers simply copied the trends in painting, but others used the camera to find beauty in the world around them.